So it's very easy in these days to get information about latest publications. And this is something that I find very important, to really stick to peer-reviewed journals and what is published there. And even if there is an article published in a peer-reviewed journal, one has to follow a little bit the discussion about this article, because in climate science there is no, there is no proof when we are talking about projections about the temperature rise in the next 100 years. You have a dozen different models based on where they were calculated, whether they were calculated in Hamburg, in the supercomputer in Hamburg, or in Britain, or in the US, and which group is doing the simulation. So I think we have to still be critical, even with peer-reviewed journals.
We were talking about Bangladesh, Ramesh. I'm sure you're familiar with that story about Western companies trying to help Bangladesh to keep the country above the water. How do you see a story like that? A Western journalist traveling to Bangladesh to cover this story. Is such a journalist in general able to get the real story from the perspective that you feel needs to be addressed?
Well, I think it's a very fundamental issue in professional journalism that you are touching upon. Of course, the Western journalist, European or an American, would have a different perspective of looking at things, just as somebody coming from Bangladesh would have a different perspective when he or she reports about what's going on in Europe. But that's part of the game, and I think any professional journalist would be and should be in a position to portray things as they really are, even though it's a different perspective. And we have to keep in mind that there are different perspectives to anything on this earth, or under the heavens, for that matter. Now, I think we have been talking just right now, until now, about the science of climate change. But there is a political aspect to it, and there's a financial aspect to it, which is extremely important, particularly as far as the developing world is concerned, where, as I said before, 2/3 of humankind still lives. And what is being discussed is not only a question of climate change in an abstract perspective, it's a question of how things would develop in those parts of the world which host 2/3 of humankind. So the question I think one has to ask oneself is, do the countries of the world, does that part of the world which has gone through industrialization and which is responsible for polluting the air, which is responsible for the majority of a huge chunk of CO2 emissions which are being emitted, is that part of the world going to halt any kind of progress, any kind of development that is made or is to be made by the countries of the developing world? That's the basic question. That's a southern perspective. There is a question also of if the developing countries have to do something to mitigate or to adjust themselves to climate change, who is going to give the money? And where is this money going to come from? How much money this will be? You see, there's a debate. All of you have heard about this official development assistance, which is the assistance provided by the industrialized countries to the developing countries to help them to develop themselves. Since Rio, we have been talking about sustainable development, though that has been almost more or less forgotten. And in Rio, we said, the international community decided, both from the north and from the south, the industrialized and developing countries, that the industrialized countries, the countries of the north, have to take the lead. And that has been forgotten also in this whole debate about climate change and who has to do what. So what I'm trying to focus at right now, you probably have heard about and read about the emissions which India and China are producing, so they should also be a party to the climate convention. I mean, there's no doubt that everybody has to be a party to an issue which concerns the whole of humankind. There's no doubt about it. But the point here is not this. The point here is that the industrialized countries, en bloc altogether, are trying to sabotage, to torpedo the convention, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that convention says that it is in the first place, for the industrialized countries to curb their CO2 emissions, which does not mean that India and China are not doing anything at all.
But allow me to play devil's advocate here.
Yes,
because
please.
if you have a situation where the developing countries in the world are saying, well, you guys in the north polluted for the last 200-300 years and you emitted the next amount of carbon that now is leading to global warming. So you did that, so we are entitled to do the same. If you allow the southern countries, the developing countries, to claim the right to have the similar level of pollution, then you would have a real serious problem. So
yes.
Somebody must take the lead on it if the developing countries do not take the lead on this.
Yes. Now, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the industrialized countries have committed themselves to take the lead. As I was trying to say, it's not that the developing countries, that India and China in the first place, are not doing anything at all to curb their emissions. They are doing a lot. And then, of course, it's a question of, let's not forget that we still live in a world in which there's a divide, the north-south divide. Industrialized world means it has all the technologies and all the money that is required, and the developing world on the whole means it has less money and it has no modern technologies. So when we're talking about curbing the emissions in the developing world, we're also talking about making available new technologies, clean technologies, and making them available in such a way that everybody can afford them. And here comes the issue of patents, the intellectual property rights and patents. Here comes the question of money. You see, you cannot have a world where you have one small part of the world dominating the rest of humankind and wanting to continue to do it for all times to come. And that is a basic issue involved in these climate negotiations as we move on to Copenhagen. And if I may suggest, I think it'll be very interesting for you as professional journalists or as bloggers to visit, for example, the South Center website, which is the southcenter.org, or the Third World Network, or Friends of the Earth International, or Via Campesina, because they really go and touch the basic issues involved. Okay.
It's interesting to hear your observations, and you're obviously touching already on issues that will be discussed here at the COP15. But it also strikes me that we're sitting next to modern journalists who are very much technology-based, science-based, and you are looking at this not from a southern perspective, but from a non-science perspective, more from a financial perspective. Is that maybe representative also for a general? I mean, would you say that there's a lack of interest in modern media, that they are too focused on the science and not enough focused on the financing side of it?
Yeah, I'm trying to touch the political and the financial aspect because they are interrelated. No, I would not condemn looking at the whole thing from the scientific point of view, which is extremely important, because without the scientific point of view, the skeptics in the industrialized world, they would not have come as far as to say that we have to do something against global warming. Let's not forget that in the United States, despite Obama, there is hardly any basic fundamental change in the position of the United States. And that is a fact we must keep in mind, see? And I don't know how far Europe is really prepared to go to accommodate the interests of the developing world, or how far it is going to push through its own vested interests under the garb of helping the developing world. I think these are very important basic issues.